Welcome to the Cold-Case Christianity Broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. We've been talking about how to memorize verses and use them to share the truth with others, to either make a case for what's true or to defend what's true. And sometimes you're doing that with people who are outside the family of Christians, outside of Christianity looking in, and they're wondering why we believe certain things. And sometimes you're doing that with people who would identify as Christians, but maybe have false belief or errant beliefs because they haven't even read the scripture. So if you memorize it, and you ingrain it in your mind, the theology of each verse, you'll both, number one, know it in a richer way, and number two, you'll be able to recite it to others. And so today, we'll be talking a little bit about how to memorize and how to use Matthew 5, the first 16 verses of the Sermon on the Mount. And again, we're going to do two things. How do you use it with others? And two, how can I best learn how to memorize it? What little tricks are in the verse that'll help me to memorize it, okay? So that's something we can talk about here in today's show. And again, this is an important verse. You could importantly memorize the entire sermon. But these first 16 verses, I think, are really helpful. This idea that when Jesus saw the crowd, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and began teaching them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You're the salt of the earth. If the salt's become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It's good for nothing, except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and place it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way they see your good deeds and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Now, that's the first 16 verses, and I'll put them on the screen here for you so you can see them. I'm reciting it out of the NASB. Everyone's got a different choice in terms of what they like to use to memorize. I like to use the NASB. It's a little bit more word for word, and maybe a little more less like culturally friendly in terms of it's not trying to interpret things the way they are said maybe today, but I think it's pretty powerful. Now, what I love about this is that I talk all the time about how two eyewitnesses see something slightly different. And this does not mean that there were necessarily two events. They're describing two. You can describe the same event, and it might sound somewhat like two different events if you're not careful. I mean, eyewitnesses do this all the time. I talk about a lot in Cold Case Christianity that when you hear two eyewitnesses describe the same event, you recall different details. There's no reason to assume that either one or the other is lying, to assume there's more than one event involved. It may just be two completely different perspectives of the same event. And that does happen in the Gospels quite a bit. And that's what actually gave me comfort that I could begin an investigation. Because if they had been word for word the same, what would you investigate? What's interesting about Matthew's Sermon on the Mount is that there's another description of this sermon offered in the Gospel of Luke. But his description is very different in that it does not center on the blesseds. And Jesus clearly, when he taught, he must have taught in both a kind of a affirmative and a negation. In other words, this is what calls you out as blessed. This is what can bless you. And this is what you ought to be concerned about, the woes. But woe to you. Well, you don't see those woes listed in Matthew's version, but you do see them listed in Luke's version. Now, you might assume these are two separate sermons. They don't have to be, though, because this is exactly what eyewitnesses do. It's about the nature of the receiver, the nature of the witness. Sometimes it can be a matter of, well, Is this person more concerned about those who are going to be blessed, or is he more of a kind of a person who's a justice person? Is he a mercy person? If you're a mercy person, you might go ahead and list the things that Jesus says that are really about mercy more than you would about judgment. But if you're a justice person, well, then you might list those things that Jesus said that were really affirmed your kind of perspective on the world more than somebody else's. It's not as though we assume that I never assumed in reading the Gospels that any of these witnesses were recording every single possible word that Jesus said in any of these interactions. It's clear that, the interaction like with the Samaritan woman, how do you know how much more was said or not said? This is what the describer chooses to describe. And it's within his prerogative to choose to describe some things and not others. This does not mean it's not inerrant. This does not mean there's any error. This just means that you're getting this writer's perspective, and this is part of what God uses when selecting the writers, is that he knows they're going to have their own perspectives. So just take a look at Luke's version of this as well. This is in Luke chapter 6. And it kind of tells you why Jesus went up on that hill. All the people were trying to touch him, and all the power was coming from him and healing them all. And at some point, when he saw these crowds coming more and more, he went up on the mountain. And after he sat down, he called his disciples. That's not in Luke's gospel, but that's what you can kind of insert those details from Matthew's gospels. In other words, one is beginning to explain the other. And it says, Luke says, in turning his gaze toward his disciples, he began to say, blessed are you who... Now here he is. He's including the blesseds. So unless he's doing two separate sermons that sound a lot alike, you're getting some new detail from Luke. And he's leaving out some detail that Matthew includes. So together, both of these give you the fullest detail, which is what every set of eyewitnesses does for you in any criminal trial. So it says, the blesseds are there. Blessed are those who are poor. Yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. These are slightly said in slightly different ways. This does not bother me. I never assumed in any eyewitness testimony, I'm capturing the gist of what is being said here, and I'm throwing it back out with my own perspective put on it, which does not mean there's error. It does not mean that something's been corrupted. Be glad in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way their fathers used to treat the prophets. Then he adds the woes. But woe to you who are rich, for you are receiving your comfort in full. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for their fathers used to treat the false prophets in the same way. Now, this is starting to help us make sense of the blesseds. Blessed are those who mourn. It really is talking about, and Luke helps us to see this, is contrasting whether we are focusing our lives and evaluating our lives based on what happens in this finite 90 years here on planet Earth, or whether we have an eternal perspective. And we recognize that if you take all what you want now, if you want to make this your heaven, there'll be no heaven later on, because you've neglected so much now in order for you to kind of huddle around your version of heaven. So Luke tells us that this sermon is as much about having an eternal view of life on earth, in which you recognize that you have a consequence for what you do now. There's a consequence for this in heaven. And that helps me to rethink how Matthew talks about the blesseds, because Luke has included the woes, which are about capitalizing on your temporal life at the risk of losing your eternal life. Now we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about how we can take some material out of Luke's sermon to help others understand the gospel.
If you asked me, Jim, are you a Californian? I would say, yes, I am a Californian, because I was born here, raised here. Look at my driver's license. It says California on it. Well, Jim, okay, what year was California founded? I don't know. How many counties are in California? I don't know. What's like the linear mileage of coastline in California? I don't know. What's the major crop that comes out of California? I don't know. What's the state legislature like? How do you pass a bill in California? I don't know. What's the population of California? If you really start to probe those kinds of questions, you're going to discover I'm a pretty crummy Californian. I don't know much about California, but you have to admit I am a Californian. Are you a Christian the way that I'm a Californian? You were kind of born and raised here? You've been one your whole life? But don't ask me too many questions, too many detailed questions, especially if you started to doubt whether Christianity was true. Like, I'm not sure I can answer those. Well, it may be that you are in the right place, but you're there by accident. You don't even know why it's the right place. You may have been raised as a Christian. You happen to hold and believe something that is actually true, but you don't know why it's true. And if that's the case, you're going to have a hard time passing the why on to your own kids. So when they get challenged by a culture that's growingly and increasingly hostile to the Christian worldview, they might know what you taught them, but they don't know why it's true. I want to have a different kind of an impact on the culture in which I live. I want to be able to offer the reasons for why I think this is true, why our voice should still be heard. That's the difference between holding a blind faith and a forensic faith.
Okay, so let's go back to our verse. How it starts here. You'll see here when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain. Now you know why he was getting up on the mountain. He was a power was being drained from him by all who were coming to be healed. He sat down up there, and his disciples came to him. Now, if that's all you had, you might think that what he's about to say is just talking about somebody else or talking about the disciples. No, you can tell from Luke. Luke says that he doesn't just say, blessed are the poor. He says, blessed are you who are poor. So clearly, he's including his disciples in this mix. But again, he sits down, and after he sits down, his disciples come to him. He opens his mouth and began to teach them, saying, and now we have the blesseds. How do you memorize all those blesseds? That's a trick, right? Like, how do we memorize all these blesseds? Well, I break them into two groups of 4, total of 8. And look, I've seen people try to draw parallels from these two. I just keep them in those 4 groups of 4 to make it easier for me to memorize, okay? So take a look at those. The first one is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So what you're going to have is a group described as blessed, and then what the blessing is in each one of these 4. The first one is, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. By the way, the last one, the second group of 4 will be, theirs is the kingdom of heaven also. So they're bookended. This is about, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And you'll see it. So blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And now you can kind of connect, from a memorization perspective, if nothing else, you can connect these two things together. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, while mourning they'll be comforted. Okay, makes sense. Blessed are the gentle, they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because their hunger and thirst will be satisfied. That makes sense as a word connection. The next verse, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The next will be called sons of God. The see God in sons of God. Help me to memorize those two. The see God and sons of God both start with an S, and they're right next to each other. So blessed are the pure in heart. Now, also what's interesting for me, if you look at the first 4, it's poor in spirit, P-O-S, right? Poor in spirit, start with the P, and then those who mourn. In the next set, the M and the P are reversed. I know this is a stupid trick, but I'm just trying to memorize the verses. So if you look at the first verse, it's blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So there's poor and mourn. Then you flip the two. Now you've got the M first. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And pure in heart and pure in spirit are so easy to confuse. That's why it's nice to see them flipped here. So you have P, pure in heart, see God, S, P, peacemakers, sons of God, S. So the PS helps me to memorize. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's how I use to memorize. And blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now why I think that last part is helpful is because we're about to go into a segment, which I think is where you can really help people to see how cool the gospel is and how anti-cultural, countercultural the gospel is. Because we end the 8 blesseds with the one that says, blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. Because he's about to now transition into, you are going to be persecuted. But he starts by talking about how blessed are those who are, that the last blessed is those who are persecuted. And how I remember that is because they are now about to talk about us being persecuted. Jesus is about to talk about how we are persecuted. Now look, I have one of the great books that talks about this, the blesseds, I think, is The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard. I think that's a great book. But however you want to parse through those, I've seen this preached a number of different ways. What I try to say when I'm sharing with people who are not believers is that Jesus doesn't require moral perfection in order to consider you somebody worthy of blessing, even worthy of the gospel. As a matter of fact, these are categories that most of us would say we don't want to be in those categories. Well, some of them we would, but I don't want to be in a position where I'm mourning. I don't want to be called poor in spirit, or even, I don't. Those seem as at least the first four. Sometimes, some of those are like, well, is gentleness? I can see what gentleness being a virtue, but is mourning a virtue? Is it virtuous to mourn? There's some confusion. Is it virtuous to be always hungering and, well, I guess to be hungering and thirsty, you're desiring, so that's positive. But can you see as a mixed bag here? What's great about it is regardless of where you are in your spiritual walk, the opportunity is still there for you to be saved. The opportunity is still there for you because there's a very mixed bag of these 8. You might, and this, for the most part, touches on almost every human experience. So wherever you are in that range of human experiences, the gospel is designed and said to you. If you're in a position of mourning, the gospel is for you. If you're seeking but don't have understanding, that you're poor in spirit, it's for you. If you're just being persecuted because you try to hold to a certain ideal, the gospel is for you. There's a range here of people described, and it turns out that all of these have a similar blessing. Now, without going into too much detail there, I try to turn a corner on this next verse, which I think is so powerful, because when I speak to Christians, what I see most of the time is that we have decided we are going to capitulate the teaching of Jesus to get along with the culture. In other words, we're going to twist the teaching of Jesus, redact some of the teaching of Jesus, modify some of the teaching of Jesus in order to get along with culture. Teaching of Jesus usually in moral categories related to sexuality, marriage, gender. But it turns out we are told early on that if we do that, we are sacrificing something. And by the way, if you ever thought that Jesus figured, hey, you'll figure out a way later on to take my words and make them acceptable to culture, no. Jesus never expected us to take his words in his teaching and find a way to wedge it in and make it acceptable to culture. In fact, he predicted exactly what's happening right now. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about, I think, the biggest takeaway from this part of the Sermon on the Mount.
Jim, as a once angry atheist, something about the Gospels struck you as being more than, and I quote you, moralistic mythologies. They actually appeared to be ancient eyewitness accounts, and that very fact became important to you. Why?
I think because when I first started, I was just interested in Jesus' words. So if it had been just a list like the Gospel of Thomas, a list of the quotes of Jesus, the kind of proverbial wisdom of Jesus, that would be one kind of document. But of course, the Gospels aren't that at all. The Gospels appear to be recording a series of events that include Jesus' words, but they appear to be a historical account. And that's a very different proposal altogether. That means that if it is history, if it's a claim about something that actually happened, it means it's falsifiable. In other words, it's like my cold cases. I have people who will say, hey, I saw this is what happened, and they give me a narrative. Well, I can actually go in and take a look and see if that's reliable. Is that true? Did it actually happen? Is it falsifiable? And that gives me a point of context, a point of reference to begin an investigation. You'd have a hard time doing that if, for example, all we had was the Gospel of Thomas, a series of proverbial statements for the most part from Jesus. We'd have a really hard time even doing any kind of an historical investigation to see if it actually occurred. But these don't have that kind of contextual feeling. As I read through them, I saw they had properties that were similar to the properties of eyewitnesses when you have more than one witness to see in an event. When you have multiple eyewitness accounts, they have a certain characteristic, a certain flavor. And at first, as I read through these, I didn't really put my finger on what it was about them I have in the book, but for me, my gut instinct as an investigator said, wow, that's interesting. I've seen that before in a robbery. I've seen that before in a homicide account. So it just caused me to take the next step. I think we're blessed as Christians that we don't believe something that's not rooted in history. We believe something that had to actually occur. As Paul said, if the resurrection didn't actually occur in history, we're to be pitied. They're lying as eyewitnesses, he says. We're a lie. It's all a lie. And that's the beautiful thing about Christianity, is it's something you can actually investigate. I'm grateful for that, because as an investigator, that's exactly how I came to faith.
Have you ever questioned the resurrection or know someone who has? Follow along with J. Warner Wallace as he examines the most important case in all of history. You'll learn how to think like a cold case detective and share the compelling evidence that Jesus truly is alive. We need to share the good news with those who desperately need to hear it. Will you become a case-maker for Christ? Order Alive in packages of 10 and begin sharing the most important message of all, the truth of the resurrection.
So let's get to what I think is the most powerful aspect of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I realize I've skipped over a lot to get here, but we got a 28-minute show, and I really want to get to this last part. Here it is. Blessed are you, says Jesus. When. That's not an if. It could be an if. He could have easily put if in there. He didn't. He put the word when. When people insult you, that's going to happen. And persecute you. Why would they do that? And falsely say all kinds of evil against you. Why? Because of me. That's right. Your affiliation with Jesus will result in insults and persecution and false accusations. That is going to happen. It's not a matter of if it happens. It's only a matter of when it happens. And if it's not happening in your life right now, you're probably doing something wrong. You probably haven't said anything about what you believe. Or you've got a different version of Jesus than the real one. He says, by the way, does he say here, I'm sorry for you, this is going to happen? I apologize? No. This is bad? No. This stinks? No. He says, rejoice and be glad, for you have a reward coming. This is exactly why Luke's edition helps us. Jesus is distinguishing between the difference between living in a temporal world and living in an eternal world. Because in the end, your reward is coming, just not in this life. It's coming in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. That's right. That's right. Anyone who spoke the words of God, prophets did that, to a world of fallen humans got spanked. Basically got treated terrible. Got persecuted. Because no fallen human wants to hear God's holy word. And so if you're going to speak that way, if you're going to just repeat what Jesus taught, get ready. You're going to be falsely accused, insulted, and persecuted. That is going to happen. But if you keep your mind, you remember, woe to those of you who think it's all about what happens in this life. Woe to those of you who think you could live in this life without mourning and weeping. No. You had to have an eternal perspective. And that's why Jesus includes the expression, for great is your reward in heaven. You should be rejoicing and be glad, no matter what you suffer here. Remember, on this side of the timeline, it's not a segment of 90 years. It's a ray. It starts at the thing we call birth, extends to what we call death, and then it goes off infinitely, eternally. And every year you're on the other side of death, your 90 years on earth seems like a millisecond by comparison. He's calling us to have an eternal perspective and to be different. And that's why, if you're not different right now, you're not suffering any judgment. You're not getting any abuse on social media because you're not any different. Your salt has become tasteless, and you can't make that tasty. You can't make it salty again. Once you've stepped out and just become the world, you're just the world. You're good for about nothing but simply thrown out underfoot and trampled on by men. That doesn't sound good to me. That's not a high... This is why it ends with salt and light. This idea that salt and light distinguish you. And salt burns. Ever had it cut open and get salt in it? Salt can do that. Salt has the ability it can do a lot of things. In the New Testament, during those times in the first century, salt was often used to cure meat, to preserve. But it also stings. Right? And now again, we did a verse in an earlier show from John chapter 1, how the light comes into the world and the darkness does not recognize, does not comprehend the light. The world wants to run away from salt and light. The world wants to reject salt and light. So you've got a choice. You can find a way. Listen, you can say, well, Jesus never talked about that, so I'm not going to talk about that either. You can say, well, maybe the old, first century writers didn't know anything about the science of gender or the science of marriage or the science of sexuality or whatever it is you want to conform to the world. But the reality of it is that the teaching of Jesus will never conform to the world. And that's why this verse, this part of the verse, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely accuse you of all kinds of evil because of me. That we're blessed when that happens. And that's something we have to take personally. So salt cannot lose its taste. If it loses its taste, it's good for nothing. And light. I mean, this is what, it's so funny. This idea he talks about lighting and putting it under a basket. No, you take it out, all who are in the house are lit by the light, right? There's a sense in which we would like to keep our views, our Christian views, we're going to be a light, but maybe just for me and my spouse. We'll talk about it. Maybe me and my kids. We'll talk about it. But we won't tell anybody else. We won't step up and stand on the hill with that light because that would draw fire. And I don't want to draw fire from anybody. So I think part of this call is for us to get out of the house where we're just a light that could be under a basket, but it gives light to the house. But get out of the house and go be the city set on a hill, and let your good deeds, let your light shine in such a way that the people outside of your family see your good deeds. Now, what's great about that is that this is clearly not just about proclaiming certain truths. It's about living in a certain way that reflect those truths, that will honor, that will actually bring attention to glorify your Father who is in heaven. And so it's not just a matter of saying certain things. It's about living a certain way. But clearly, this verse before that says you will be insulted and persecuted and accused of, that's going to have to, that probably is not by how you're living. That part is going to be based on something you've said or proclaimed or believed or said is true. So it's a combination of saying something that's true, that holding on to those beliefs and proclaiming them to the world, that's what's going to get you insulted. And it's a matter of living in a certain way that brings glory to God. And I think these two things are mentioned by Jesus intentionally, because it turns out that one of the things that validates the teaching of Jesus is that we live a certain way. If you're the kind of person who's been selfish, been a bad example of what it is to be a Christian, then get ready that no one's going to listen to anything you say. But these hard words that you say that people want to persecute you for are far more likely to be embraced if they see that your life is sacrificial, that you are living in a certain way that glorifies God. So it turns out there's two things we do as Christians to change the world. We say tough things that are going to cause many people to persecute us, but we live a certain way that glorifies our Father. Anyway, hope that helps you as you look through Matthew chapter 5. And we'll be doing, I think, one more verse on this. And until then, I'll see you right back here at Cold-Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold-Case Christianity Broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.